Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Ellie Vega, and I am the Underserved Population Support Advocate here at Standpoint. My role today is just to help facilitate this webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll be able to check it out on Standpoint's YouTube page. The link to the recording will also be emailed out to Standpoint's Legal Advocate listserv. I will put in the chat box the link to the PowerPoint for people to follow along with. And if you have questions during the presentation, please type your question in the Q&A tab, and I will pass the question along to the presenters. We're probably going to save questions for the end because we are a little short on time this afternoon. Most of you probably already know about our organization, but for those that listen to this later and those who don't know, Standpoint is a statewide organization. We're a team of attorneys and advocates working to assist individuals who have experienced domestic violence, sexual violence, and trafficking when it includes domestic or sexual violence. We also provide assistance to systems professionals who work with survivors. We do this by facilitating trainings and answering calls to our action line. Examples of trainings we do are our annual new laws throughout the state of Minnesota, monthly webinars like this one, and other trainings on request. Our action line is answered Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., and it is through our action line that our attorneys provide legal advice to survivors and our advocates connect callers with resources, safety plan, listen, and help callers identify possible options and next steps. I'll now introduce our wonderful panel, our wonderful presenters for this afternoon. Andy Lowe, our staff attorney with a labor trafficking focus. Andy joined Standpoint in April 2024. Andy attended Penn State Law, during which time he served as lead student counsel at the Civil Rights Appellate Clinic and as a student attorney at the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau. After settling into Minnesota, Andy represented clients in immigration and family law matters at Igbonigo Partners International Law Firm and Groshek Law. Andy has spent most of his career helping people with few resources facing dire circumstances, including those facing immigration authorities, marriage dissolution, and eviction. As a staff attorney at Standpoint, Andy provides legal advice and representation to victim survivors of labor trafficking, as well as recruits and supports volunteer attorneys who provide pro bono representation for people experiencing labor trafficking. Anna Maria Studer, Advocacy Support Program Manager. Anna Maria joined Standpoint in October of 2022. She has worked in the domestic violence field since 2006, providing advocacy to victim survivors from various demographic groups. She has extensive experience in shelter, legal, and community outreach advocacy. Anna Maria is also the manager of community services for a domestic violence organization, overseeing the criminal justice, housing, on-scene, and prevention and education programs. Anna Maria is an advocate in the labor trafficking project. Prior to moving to the United States in 1991, she worked as a family doctor in Venezuela. She has a medical doctor degree from Universidad Central de Venezuela and did her specialization in family medicine. I'll now post the link and we can get started.
Okay, thank you so much, Ellie, for the introduction. And thank you all for being here. We're going to talk about empowering advocates combating human trafficking. We know that human trafficking is a public health issue, it's a human rights violation, and a public safety issue. Human trafficking is the business of stealing freedom for profit that is going to impact individuals, families, and communities. It is a multi-billion-dollar criminal industry. Human trafficking involves the exploitation of a person for labor or sex, or sometimes for both. It's going to affect all ages and is often accompanied by other forms of exploitation and abuse. Labor and sex trafficking often overlap as victims, especially women and girls who are trafficked for labor, are also vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Human trafficking is both a global and local problem. And Minnesota has become a leader in the nation in its response to sex trafficking, and it's building its response to labor trafficking at the present moment. For the next one, TVPA. Okay. TVPA A definition of human trafficking. The Trafficking Victim Protection Act, or TVPA of 2000, is a federal law that's going to provide the United States government with tools and resources to combat human trafficking. Their three P's are prevention, protection, and prosecution. According to the Traffic Victims Protection Act, human trafficking is a crime that is going to involve the exploitation of someone for the purpose of compelled labor or commercial sex act through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Prior to the passage of the TVPA, some laws were in place to criminalize acts of human trafficking, but these laws were not enough to combat trafficking. The TVPA was enacted to ensure a comprehensive response to trafficking that was going to include a standard federal definition to increase victim identification and targeted criminal justice response. The DVPA noted that trafficking is a modern form of slavery and the largest manifestation of slavery today. Before the passage of this TVPA, the seriousness of the crime and its components weren't reflected in the guidelines for sentencing, and this made for weak penalties for convicted traffickers.
Maria,
Yes,
I cannot see your screen. I'm not sure if the attendees can.
you can't see me?
I cannot see your screen. Or Andy, are you sharing screen? Okay, I think we're good.
Okay. Uh, Sex trafficking. The federal definition of sex trafficking is going to be the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act, in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform the act is under 18 years old. What is force? It's going to include physical restraint, physical harm, sexual assault, beatings, monitoring or confinement. It's often used to control the victims, especially during the early stages of the victimization, to break down the victim's resistance. Fraud includes false promises regarding employment, wages, working conditions, love, marriage, or a better life. Over time, there may be unexpected changes in work conditions, compensations, or in the agreements or nature of the relationship. Coercion includes threats of serious harm to or physical restraint against any person, psychological manipulation, document confiscation, and shame and fear inducing threats to share information or pictures with others or to do reports to law enforcement or the authorities. What is labor trafficking? Under federal law, labor trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services using force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. What is involuntary servitude? Is any plan or pattern intended to cause a person to work against their will. Peonage is the status or condition of involuntary servitude based on real or alleged financial obligation. Debt bondage includes a pledge of services by the debtor or someone under this person's control to pay down known or unknown wages. Sometimes they get charged for transportation, boarding, food, or other things, including sometimes they get charged for bad behavior. The length and nature of these services are not limited and defined, and sometimes the individuals get trapped in a cycle of debt that they can never pay down. Slavery is the state of being under the ownership of control of someone when a person is forced to work for another. We need to make clear that the Minnesota law for sex and labor trafficking is different than the federal, and the response to labor trafficking is growing. Andy will talk about the Minnesota law for sex and labor trafficking later on in our presentation. But it's good to know that there have been findings that in Minnesota, the most common type of labor trafficking is the recruitment of women from foreign countries to perform housekeeping and childcare in family homes. There is a significant overlap between labor trafficking and labor exploitation among both local and foreign victims, and a high percentage of labor trafficking cases involve known labor law violations like wage theft, where the employer avoids paying or fails to pay wages that the employees have earned. They use unsafe working conditions, and it's also sexual harassment included. Now let's talk a little bit about forced marriage because we see that too. This is a type of trafficking that involves marrying someone against their will. In this case, a victim is going to be forced to work, to live in inhumane conditions, or may be forced to marry with the intent of using them for sexual exploitation or forced labor. I have an example. I worked with a woman when I was working in shelter. She didn't get married by force. She just got married because she fell in love with this man. She was from Vietnam. He was from Vietnam, but he was an American citizen. So they got married. And as soon as they go to the US, her nightmares started. She couldn't eat at the table. She had to eat by herself on the floor. She got pregnant, and then he told her that she has the choice of having more children so he could get more tax refunds, or to work at least 3 jobs because she had to pay him for bringing her to the US. So her response was that she was not going to do any of those two because she wanted to be able to take care of their son that they had. So he went back to the private immigration attorney that they have to cancel the sponsorship that she had towards her, and she was going to be deported. She was lucky enough that the attorney that they had was well known. She knew a lot about domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. So she gave her information under the table about legal aid and about the program that I was working with, and we were able to work with her. And now she is a U.S. citizen. Um, Next one, methods of trafficking. So why does human trafficking happen? Um, Perpetrators of human trafficking do for monetary and financial gain. They are aided by the fact that it remains a much hidden crime and one that is very difficult to detect. Many victims live in fear of their exploiters and will never speak up about what they're going through. And some of the methods that they use are seduction or romance is one of the most common methods of human trafficking. In these cases, a person seduces someone else in order to force them into prostitution or other illegal work. And it is a form of grooming and abuse. These people form a romantic relationship with the victims. However, the relationship is quickly going to turn in an emotional abusive one. There's a lot of blackmail and violence used to intimidate the victims into compliance. They might also paint a picture of a better life together abroad, or they can go to a different state or different country. In some cases, they're forced to move to a country where they can't speak the language. And using romance in this way make it easier for traffickers to move their victims across the borders, and they will go often willingly. False jobs advertisements. It's another common method of trafficking. They attract people with false jobs advertisements or travel opportunities. They often post jobs opportunities on legitimate websites using a registered business as a front. They target places where they know people are looking for ways to live or make a life elsewhere, like countries experiencing an economic down thing or instability. These jobs are often nannies, au pair positions in the hospitality industry, and here in Minnesota, we see them a lot in farm workers. Traffic people will usually pay for their own flight, and when they get here in the country legally with all their documents, as soon as they get here, the documents are taken away, and the victim is forced to comply through a series of abusive acts, including sometimes torture, forced consumption of drugs and alcohol, for example, just to keep them in place. Sale by family. We have heard about some areas of the world where there's really bad levels of poverty and debt. Desperation and displacement cause families to sell their children to traffickers. And sometimes they don't even know that these people are traffickers. They think that they are selling the kids to somebody that wants to marry them or that want to take them somewhere else to take them to school. And it's also the pressure so they do it to alleviate the pressure of the hardship and bring some money to the family. And this causes the families to sell a child into modern slavery. Recruitment through former victims of traffic. This happen, and it's happened in domestic violence shelter, for example, in homeless shelter. In some cases, former victims might recruit new people into the trafficking network. They may earn commission from the exploiters for each new person they recruit, or they can be promised greater freedom if they do. I saw a few of these cases when I was working in a domestic violence shelter. They are hard to notice unless you start seeing the red flags and you talk to them deeply. Um, so they go to shelter, the person that is trying to recruit, they go to the shelter, faking a domestic violence victim, being a domestic violence victim, and just they try to recruit women that are going through difficult times and they're vulnerable and they're easy to convince. The other ones are migrants, immigrants, and domestic work. For example, a diplomat, can try to talk to somebody from their home country with an offer to come to the United States to take care of their children, for example. They promise the worker they're going to get paid a good wage, that they're going to have opportunity to go to school. They repeatedly keep telling them that they are lucky because they have the opportunity to get out of the country where they are and go to a better country and send more money to their family. And then when they get here, things change, and the worker is told that she will gonna have to sleep in a in the garage or in the closet, is responsible for keeping the house and the yard, serving all the meals, and taking care of the children. The passport can be taken away, and they are told that they can't leave the house without permission. When they complain, then they threaten the family back home, and they will tell the person here that if they call the police, they're going to be arrested. Um, Exploitation of disabilities. This is something that is often seen, where traffickers may seek out victims that have disabilities and they want to gain access to their public benefits like SSI or Social Security disability insurance and benefits. Individuals with disabilities may require a caregiver to meet their basic needs, and this caregiver can take advantage of this dependency and force them into prostitution or labor. Even if the caregiver themselves is not the trafficker, people with disabilities may have learned to respond, to comply with the caregiver wishes because they are dependent on them. So they may have normalized an equal power dynamic in an unequal power dynamic between them and the abuser. And this could carry over to the relationship with the trafficker or the new abuser. Some individuals with disabilities may have difficulties with communication or speech, so it's really hard for them to get help, to call, to report the abuse, and they are dependent 100% of the trafficker for interpretation. People with disabilities may be sheltered and isolated from friends and relationships. Traffickers may also target individuals with disabilities because of the social discrimination and prejudice that they face. Now, we need to know that human trafficking does not have to involve movement from one place to another at all. A person can be trafficked in their very own home, like what happened with these people with disabilities. There is a myth um, that is problematic because it blends trafficking with smuggling, and it's going to lead to solutions in the name of fighting trafficking that are unrelated to how trafficking actually happens. Who are the traffickers? Just that, like, there is not one type of trafficking victim. Perpetrators of this crime also vary. Traffickers could be anyone, all genders, races, ethnicities, walks of life. They can be foreign nationals, US citizens, family members, partners, strangers. We need to remember about the Epstein case. They can act alone or they can be part of an organized criminal group. People often incorrectly assume that all traffickers are male. However, in the United States, have been some females have been prosecuted as traffickers. So it doesn't matter the sex, it could be anybody. Who are the victims? Anyone can be trafficked, but some people are far more vulnerable than others because they have greater needs. Victims of human trafficking can be like the traffickers, any race, color, nationality, disability, religion, age, gender, sexual education. But it is, as is the case in many crimes of exploitation and abuse, human traffickers often are going to prey on members of marginalized communities and other vulnerable individuals and potentially more susceptible to the traffic manipulation and control. What factors can increase the victim's vulnerability or poverty, young age, racial or ethnic marginalization, history of abuse and exploitation, disability, isolation, chemical dependency, lack of a support system, lack of an immigration status, different cultural background, fleeing a crisis situation like the people that come to our shelters, LGBTQ identity, lack of strong borders, labor protections, homelessness, especially runaway youth, and somebody, a juvenile delinquency that have a criminal record. So many risk factors related to human trafficking are going to overlap, meaning that an individual experiences more than one of the circumstances that is considered a risk factor. For example, somebody that live in poverty and race, they normally are related problems in many of our communities. We also know that juveniles are extremely vulnerable to be trafficked, especially those that are runaway youth. Um, Also, while US citizens can be trafficked for labor and sex, foreigners who are escaping violence or poverty suffer unique vulnerabilities like unfamiliarity of the language, of the place, lack of support system. Sometimes they don't have any family around. And we need to remember as advocates that survivors of sex trafficking and labor trafficking are often hiding in plain sight. Sex trafficking thrives in silence, and it's up to us to recognize the signs and be able to help these kind of victims. I brought the power and control wheel for sex and labor trafficking. I know we are all familiar about the power and control wheel for domestic violence and sexual assault and all the other control wheels that we have seen, but this one is based on the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project of Duluth, and it was developed by the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. This power and control wheel outlines the different types of abuse that can occur in labor and sex trafficking situations. So how do we screen for trafficking? We know there are some red flags, but red flags is not a screening tool, but it can be useful. It can serve as an easy and quick guide to help us recognize a group of signs that might indicate that human trafficking. We might have a resident or a shelter that have been trafficked, and unless we have the knowledge of how to identify them, this victim might not be able to receive the services that they really need. So it's important to know that before incorporating any screen tool, there's a whole bunch out there. Um, Agencies and organizations should develop a trauma-informed policy and procedures for staff to follow if the screening comes out positive. Some toolkits can effectively identify people who have been trafficked, and other ones, identify people that are vulnerable for trafficking. General signs to look for that will indicate that an individual might be experiencing trafficking. It's sometimes they act fearful, they're anxious, they're depressed, they can be submissive, tense, and they can show being nervous, particularly when they're speaking about their employer or someone they know. Um, Sometimes they can tell you that they used to have a person that speaks for them, so they don't have too many answers of the questions that you're asking. Sometimes they don't know the date, the month, the year. They might not be in control of their personal IDs or passports. Sometimes they don't know their address. They don't know where they were living before. They try to avoid eye contact. When they're telling the story is kind of confusing, contradicting. Um, they can tell you that they were not allowed to come and go at their own will when they were before coming to the shelter. They can be wearing the same clothes over and over, or we can see that they use expensive clothing. They have money, they have jewelry, and they can explain how they got that. They can share that they couldn't move freely, they were attached to someone, and they might also say that they owe money to an employer. So someone may be experiencing, and I'm saying maybe experiencing labor trafficking if they work as a work in a farm, as a farm worker, as a domestic worker, and factory workers. They can be living and working in isolated conditions. They are cut off from interactions with other people or support system. They may be monitored by another person when they talk or when they interact with others. They can tell you that they have been threatened with deportation by their boss. They can be working in dangerous conditions where they don't have safety gear, they don't have any training, they don't have adequate breaks or other kind of protections. A lot of them live in dangerous and overcrowded spaces, inhumane conditions that are provided by the employer. Someone may be experiencing sex trafficking if they work in the commercial sex industry, like escorts, exotic dancers, sex workers, massage parlors. Signs of having sex with multiple people, they can be overprotective with their phone, they can have multiple phones with them. They sometimes show like sudden changes in behavior, in the dress style. They might tell you that they have a boyfriend or a husband that or a pimp. Sometimes we can see tattoos or branding of ownerships, they're called. They can be talking and have a language of the sex industry. They can have inappropriate clothing for the venue or the weather. And they can show signs of physical abuse, also use of alcohol or drugs. Sometimes they can look malnourished. They can share that they were transported by people from their home to the workplace. Organizations that have received the necessary training to provide screenings for human trafficking, they need to create specific internal policies and protocols to guide the implementation. They have to make sure that the policies and procedures include language interpreter services. And it's very important to use professional interpreters. And all interpreters should be screened for potential conflict of interest prior the meeting with the client, especially in rural areas where communities are very small and close-knit. In these cases, it's better to use a professional phone interpreter than someone from the same community as a client. Certain aspects of the screening protocol should and can be adapted to accommodate the particular needs of specific individuals or populations served by the organization. The screeners should remain not judgmental and encourage empowerment and autonomy by allowing the client to make their own choices. Before screening any client, it's important that we have prepared a referral list of services that meet their immediate and long-term needs, the physical needs, psychological support, immigration attorneys, transportation, criminal court advocacy, safe housing information. Also, we need to have a list of local and national anti-trafficking resources. It's going to be very helpful in this situation. A trauma-focused approach, victim-centered, and individual-centered is critical when we are working with individuals who have been trafficked. We need to remember that they have a lifetime history of trauma, and it's not uncommon for survivors of trafficking to feel like they are not being trafficked. Uh, Physically separating someone from the trafficker might be the work of a day, but to separate them psychologically from the trafficker might be a long work with therapists and psychologists. What are the barriers to leaving? Does somebody have a question? There's something in the chat? No? Okay. So why victims don't leave? We know that trafficking survivors experience severe chronic trauma and harm. Traffickers use calculated methods to maintain control over their victims. While often we can see visible signs of control tactics, we can see injuries, bruising, burn marks, scars, tattoos with the name of the trafficker. Sometimes they have a tattoo of a money sign or a currency symbols. Many tactics are not visible and maybe less obvious to us. So this trauma, along with other circumstances are going to create real barriers to getting out of the trafficking situation. Many victims of trafficking, due to the trauma, to the manipulation, and the lack of awareness, and the lack of awareness means that they don't understand the concept of human trafficking, or they don't know what their rights are as a victim. They may believe that they're simply in a difficult situation. So all this may not initially help them recognize themselves as victims or see that they need any help. And they believe, or often believing that they are making their own choices. So some of the barriers to escape from labor and sex trafficking may be unique, but most could be similar to both. Some of these barriers are one, and big one is the trauma bonding with the trafficker. This is the most common meaning of trauma bonding is when a trafficker uses rewards and punishment with cycles of abuse to foster a powerful emotional connection with the victim. Traffickers may take a role of protector to maintain control of the victim, create confusion, and develop a connection or attachment, which may include the victim feeling a sense of loyalty or love for the trafficker. This connection or traumatic bond becomes especially intense when fear of the trafficker is paired with gratitude for any kindness that the trafficker shows to them. We have heard about the Stockholm syndrome before, and it's a form of psychological connection with the captors. Trauma bonding is not seen in all victims of trafficking, but is primarily linked to all the trauma response of the brain. Extreme fear of traffickers or employers because of threats and blackmail. There's threats of violence can be towards the victim or towards the victim's family. A trafficker might take also sexually explicit photos or videos of their victim and then threaten to publish those images and send them to their family. The risk of having the reputation and community connections destroyed make them be silenced. Distrust of authority. We know that victims of human trafficking often distrust law enforcement because of either fear, threats, misinformation, or because they had bad experiences before with law enforcement. Traffickers may also convince victims that if they report them to the police, they're going to be put in jail. And if they are immigrants, of course, they're always using the immigration status. And they say if you call the police, you're going to be arrested and you're going to be deported. So that's why they start distrusting authority. And most of the time it's misinformation. The other thing is that the trafficker provides and controls all the needs of the victim. He provides love, food, money, shelter, stable employment, forms of identification. So leaving the trafficker may be returning to a life of poverty and instability. Most of the people trapped in trafficking don't have anyone they can text or call for help. No matter where they come from or where they've trafficked to, some of the survivors are simply unlikely to have any access to resources needed to find their way back home. This is especially likely in cases of minors. Immigrants may have no clue where they are or where they are being kept. They keep being told that if they talk to the police, they're going to be arrested, that nobody's going to believe them. They might not even speak the language. A survivor of sex trafficking might also face intense cultural stigma and shame that leaves them at risk of being socially outcast if they return to their community, especially for sex traffic victims. Often traffickers will manufacture huge debts that a trafficked person must pay off before they can leave. Like we said before, it's called debt bondage. And that might be due because they're charging them for all the things, travel, recruitment, or anything else that the traffic person is being charged for. And sometimes they really think they won't be able to leave until they pay the money that they own. Um, Traffickers also include substance, so they want to make their victims addicted to certain drugs, and they frequently provide drugs and alcohol to the victims as a control method. Many trauma survivors are psychologically unable to envision any future outside the reality that they live. And this might be reinforced by a deep sense of worthlessness that is ingrained because of the repeated abuse they have been going through. It may also be reinforced because of the social stigma related to sex work. And it can be cause the survivors doesn't want to leave the situation because they feel they're going to be rejected by the community. What can we do to help? So to work with human trafficking, we need to form a collaborative response. We need to educate ourselves and others, learn how to recognize the signs of human trafficking, the red flags, and we need to learn how to respond to them. We can help create awareness, organize fundraisings, host an event, volunteering. If we don't have too much experience with human trafficking victims, volunteer in a local anti-trafficking organization with their work can help us get a little bit of experience. Meeting or writing to our local, state, and federal elected officials. Let them know that you care about combating human trafficking. Ask them what they're doing to address it. Advocate for policies and practices that protect people from trafficking. We need to also encourage local schools and school districts to include human trafficking in their curriculum to develop protocols. Educate the staff on how to identify the human trafficking in youth and how to respond to suspect cases because it happens. Familiarize yourself with the 24-hour National Human Trafficking Hotline. We have the numbers at the end of our presentation. And it's not only to report a tip, but it's also to connect with services. We can ask them questions. We can request trainings. We also need to keep a list of local and national organizations that can provide services to these victims, like emergency shelters, counseling, legal assistance, immigration assistance. We need to know if our workplace is trauma informed. If not, well, let's talk to human resources to see if we can start implementing a trauma informed practices. Um, this trauma informed is a strength based approach, and it's going to prioritize safety, empowerment, and trust in these victims. It's based on the understanding that trauma can impact the person's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So we need to learn how to work with these survivors. We need to have to create a welcome environment, be kind, be sensitive to triggers that could be potentially coming up with the way we treat them. Be careful with touches, with hugs, with specific places. Sometimes if there's somebody that have the voice or the mannerism as their trafficker could trigger them to a response. Meet the person's physical needs, maintain a calm voice. We need to remain at eye level, maintain eye contact. We need to learn how to get their trust. Do not criticize the trafficker because sometimes the victim may get upset and end up defending the trafficker, and that's it. They're not going to talk to you. Keep in mind that the individual could be intoxicated, they could be withdrawing or even drug seeking. And we need to understand that trauma can manifest in exaggerating responses, hypervigilance, avoidance. They can be declining to answer any questions. They might not want to engage in any conversations. They can have elevated emotions or dissociations. They can act like in trance, like they're in trance. Um, we need to know that these usual symptoms and reactions are because of the trauma they've been through. We need to learn how to use grounding techniques if they help the client um, calm down from that state of stress. Um, Many individuals that have been trafficked have had all the control taken away from their trafficker. So we need to offer them as much control as possible during the screening to help them build trust. It is very important that we respect the autonomy of the client. That way they can experience having control of their own actions and choices, maybe for the first time in months. Um, Prioritize safety, be patient. We don't pressure the victims to answer questions. We need to be empathetic, understand that the victims have a variety of experiences that make it very difficult to trust others. Um, we have to be strength-based, focus on helping victims rebuild their sense of control and empowerment. We need to integrate knowledge about trauma into our policies, our procedures, our practices, and try to avoid re-traumatization. So what are the benefits of a trauma-informed practice? It's when their survivor is going to feel more supported and validated. They're more likely to engage with the justice system. They have better access to support services. And they could be more likely to have successful legal outcomes if they want to report the trafficking. Um, Last but not least, we're going to talk a little bit about safety planning, what is very important when working with survivors of human trafficking. And they can include risk assessments, preparations if they want to leave the trafficker, alternative actions to increase the safety of the human trafficking victim or the individual at risk for human trafficking, and also how to increase the safety of the agency where they are or the individuals that are assisting the victim. So for safety planning, I'm just going to touch in some important points. It could be a whole training by itself. Each individual is going to be in the best position to assess their own current level of safety, and safety planning should be customized to their unique circumstances. Safety planning is important while the victim is experiencing trafficking, during the process of leaving the trafficker, or once the victim has left. We need to recognize that the person in the situation knows their situation best than we do, and it's necessary to honor them, to honor their request to make sure that they are safe. Um, Making an assessment of the current risk, yeah, identifying potential safety concerns. If the person is still living with the trafficker, make sure you have secrecy. Try to create a code language, like if they call you or if they call somebody, there is a phrase or a word. If they're texting, that means that they need help. And it's going to be something that is going to raise suspicion from the trafficker. We can use third parties if they trust somebody, a family member, or a community organization. Make sure that we use that trusted person as the link that they can reach if they need something. Provide the victim with a number of the National Human Trafficking Hotline. They can get confidential assistance through that line. If they want to leave and they want escape plan, we need to figure out where are safe places that the person can go. If she escapes, like a local shelter, a trusted friend, law enforcement, any public space that we know that is safe for the victim to go. If they need escape route, try to see what is the living situation, where are the potential exits, and where are the transportation options, because it doesn't make any sense if they're going to leave and they don't have a way to get where they want to go. If they can get some of the documents, that will be great. We know that sometimes, or most of the times, the traffickers take all their forms of identification, but we need to encourage them to get some of the documents if they can, without getting themselves at risk of being harmed, like IDs, passport, birth certificates, if they can have any evidence of abuse, like photos, text messages. Um, we need to make sure that we're using code text messages. If they're going to if they're going to call you, make sure that she have a code, like we said before, that one can mean I'm good, I can talk right now. The other code can say I can't talk right now. It's not safe. We need to help them increase their self-esteem, because remember that some of them, they think that is their fault that they are in that position. And we need to make sure that they know it's not your fault and you deserve to be safe. This is not right. Always prioritize the victim's safety and autonomy. Respect their decisions. They know better where they are. If they need professional support, we can connect them with qualified counselors specialized in human trafficking. If they want to collaborate with law enforcement, we need to wait until the victim is ready. We have to discuss the options for reporting the trafficking situation to law enforcement. What are the risks? What are the safety concerns? After they leave the situation, they should contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline. They are going to find the nearest service provider that can assist them. They can help them with long-term safety planning, including taking out a protective order if they want to do that. If the controller has made or the trafficker has made unwanted contact with the person, with the survivors, they should be documenting. Tell them that to save the calls, the texts. If they have threatening voicemails, to keep those voicemails. It's going to be important to save all this information later on if they're going to work with an immigrant, if with an immigration attorney, if they're immigrants, in order to file for a T visa. Um, what else? If they have their own place and they trust their neighbors or a friend, same thing, create a code or tell the neighbor if I flick my lights at my house means I need help. I mean, just a huge safety planning with these victims. Um, Let them know that they need to block the traffickers on their cell phones, on any social media, change their pictures in social media, change their names to something that the trafficker won't recognize. And if possible, survivors should avoid visiting the same place or cultural communities that the trafficker frequents. These suggestions for safety planning are not all inclusive, but they are meant to increase opportunities for safety. And like I said before, they need to be tailored to the survivors' unique circumstances, if different cultures, different ages. So that's all I have for this. And now Andy will help us understand trafficking under the legal and immigration system.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria. All right, now that we've established a bit of a foundation for what trafficking looks like, we are going to dive into the legal lens. Through this, you will hopefully be equipped with a better framework when thinking of trafficking, allowing you to more readily identify when someone may have suffered trafficking and therefore may qualify for trafficking related services. You should also become more comfortable continuing to listen and think about a case when you hear the word trafficking. Just because someone is a survivor of labor trafficking does not mean that they do not qualify for domestic violence services, sexual violence services, or housing related services, for example. The same situation can qualify as more than one thing. We generally tend to think of human trafficking as split between two categories: labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Sex trafficking has its own category in both criminal law and immigration law. It's shocking, it's memorably horrific. Um, And under Minnesota law, there's no coercion element that's necessary to prove sex trafficking. So anyone who acts as a pimp or madam can legally be considered a sex trafficker here. Labor trafficking, on the other hand, has a coercion component under Minnesota law. Under federal immigration law, on the other hand, both sex and labor trafficking require coercion and are mostly the same from a mechanical standpoint. Sex trafficking is a process that forces another person to perform some kind of sexual service for the commercial profit of the trafficker, such that a reasonable person of the same background and in the same circumstances would have no choice but to perform or to continue performing that service or face severe harm. Sex trafficking is mechanically a subset of labor trafficking, almost identical. The only fundamental difference from labor trafficking is that sex trafficking must have a third party from which the trafficker derives commercial profit. Labor trafficking is a process in which a person participates in a process that forces another person to perform some kind of service for the benefit of a trafficker, such that a reasonable person of the same background and the same circumstances would have no choice but to perform or to continue performing that service or face severe harm. Different people may be involved in different parts of this process, such as transporting, housing, advertising the availability of services to the victims. The key here is that the trafficking victim is forced to perform labor for the trafficker in some way. So let's briefly here take a look at trafficking under Minnesota law. As you can see, it covers debt bondage, forced coerced labor or services, slavery or practice similar to slavery, and the removal of organs through the use of coercion or intimidation, plus profiting off any of the same. However, consider all these factors. What do they all have in common? They are all just different, specific ways of describing forced or coerced labor or services. Mechanically, everything else is just a subset of this single category. I'll pass on to Anna Maria briefly to go through.
Yeah, now I'm gonna explain a little bit the Minnesota Human Trafficking and Exploitation Response, the Safe Harbor Law, and the Not Wrong Door. I don't know if you have heard about this before. The Minnesota Human Trafficking Prevention and Response approach spans as a statewide network of multidisciplinary partners, including organizations that are going to provide services like housing, shelter, outreach, and support to victims, survivors of human trafficking and exploitation, sex, and labor. The response is going to include services for victims of labor trafficking and sex trafficking and exploitation of all ages and genders. In Minnesota, youth commercial sexual exploitation occurs when someone aged 24 and younger engages in sexual activity in exchange for the promise of something of value, like money, drugs, food, shelter, transportation, for example. The Safe Harbor program in July of 2016 increased the prior eligibility age for services from 18 years old to 24 years old. Youth sex trafficking is one type of sexual exploitation in which someone other than the buyer or victim profits from a facilitate or facilitates the commercial sexual exploitation of the youth. Minnesota Safe Harbor law protects youth under the age of 18 from being criminalized for prostitution. They are not considered criminals anymore. They are victims and survivors of sexual exploitation and in need of services. They will be treated with dignity and respect and direct to supported services like shelter and housing that are going to meet their needs, and they're going to recognize their right to make their own choices. So what does the Minnesota Safe Harbor law specifically do? It's going to exclude sexual exploited youth under 18 from the definition of delinquent child. It's going to add the definition of sexually exploited youth to the Minnesota Child Protection Code. So sex trafficking of a minor is a mandatory child protection response. Child protection must be notified of all youth victims of sex trafficking, whether or not their family are involved in the trafficking. It's going to increase the penalties against commercial sex abusers or purchasers like Jones and trafficking victims. Direct the Commissioner of Public Safety to devise a victim-centered statewide response for sexually exploited youth and youth at risk of sexual exploitation. It's going to direct implementation of a statewide service model called No Wrong Door. And this No Wrong Door is a service model that makes sure that the Safe Harbor law actually works. It lays out ways for communities across the whole state of Minnesota to get the knowledge, the skills, and the resources needed to identify sexually exploited at-risk youth. Youth are provided with victim-centered, trauma-informed services and safe housing. This includes regional navigators, shelter and housing, protocol development, and training. In Minnesota, the schools do something called survey, a Minnesota Student Survey. It's a census of young people in Minnesota schools. One of the questions that they use, I don't know if they're still using it, but one of the questions that they use is, have you ever traded sex or sexual activity to receive money, food, drugs, alcohol, a place to stay, or anything else? In 2022, where 70% of the public school districts participated, this question was asked to 9th and 11th graders, and 1.3% answered yes. This meant that in 2022, at least 4,800 youth in Minnesota who were high school age have traded sex. And this is likely an underestimated number because the Minnesota Student Survey is completed by students enrolled in school. It does not include youth who were not in school on the day of the survey or who do not attend school. Young people may have been reluctant to answer yes for many reasons, including shame or fear. By percentage of race and ethnicity, the most impacted were natives, And by gender, the most impacted were transgender or gender diverse and Native students who identified as lesbian, gay, bi, trans, and two-spirit. Minnesota tribal nations address sex and labor trafficking with their respective reservations. They have a lot of organizations that work with their Native people. Support and the support is provided through the Safe Harbor state funding as well as the federal funding from the Office of Victim of Crime. If you want more information, it's the Minnesota Department of Health has tons of information about this program. They also have the information of how to contact the regional navigators depending of the area. And also, you can also contact Standpoint's Action Line advocates to us. You can call our line at 612-343-9842 for legal advice or for technical assistance and training in developing and implementing protocols for responding to sex trafficking and exploitation of youth to up to age 24. So that is very important to know.
Thank you, Ana Maria.
Yeah.
All right. So, what does coerced labor look like? Here's the definition of forced or coerced labor under Minnesota law. Let's take a few seconds to read through it. The first prong covers using threats and schemes. It goes through a long list of factors, but basically, if doing something terrible to a reasonable person would cause them to perform coerced labor, then threatening them with the same conduct would also cause them to produce coerced labor. Any conduct that would amount to labor trafficking, threatening the victim survivor with the conduct would also be labor trafficking. Note that Minnesota trafficking law specifically contemplates a trafficker using forced or coercive sexual contact as a means of obtaining labor from a victim. This spells out why human trafficking is labor trafficking. All human trafficking is labor trafficking. The statute explicitly states that in labor trafficking, sex can be either the means of obtaining labor or the labor itself. The first line of this trafficking statute states that the victim survivor may be forced to provide labor or service of any kind. This necessarily includes sexual services. So if an abuser forces someone to have sex with them through coercive means, this may qualify as labor trafficking. Keep this in mind when assessing whether someone qualifies for the services of your organization or project. Facts that amount to labor trafficking under Minnesota law can also amount to domestic or sexual violence. On the other hand, prongs 1 and 2 state that if an abuser uses non-consensual sex or the threat of it as a means to obtain labor from the victim survivor, that can also be a form of labor trafficking. Of course, threatening someone into performing threatening someone into performing labor is also labor trafficking. It doesn't have to be the threat of sex. The third prong defines coerced labor in terms of physical restraint. If you tie somebody to a chair until they agree to do what you want, that is coercive. I would hope you agree. So is locking somebody in an apartment or a bedroom. And here we have the remaining 3 examples spelled out by Minnesota law for defining coerced labor. It'll take another few seconds to read through it. Prong 4 is what typically comes to mind for labor trafficking. If you beat someone to force them to labor for you, that's coerced labor. If you gaslight them into performing labor for you, that's coerced labor. If you control someone's money so completely that they can't reasonably refuse you, that's coerced labor. If you destroy someone's reputation in their community to force them to perform labor for you, that's coerced labor. Prong 5, abuse of the legal process, can sometimes come in the context of police corruption and other government corruption, but it most often comes up in the context of immigration. Calling ICE on an immigrant is probably not illegal in itself, but threatening to call ICE on an immigrant if they don't perform labor for you is illegal. Prong 6 also tends to come up most often with immigrants. Immigrants can face very limited options to obtain a new copy of their documents and be unable to do many of the usual things you and I enjoy without those documents. It should not come as a surprise to anyone that confiscating somebody else's passport or other government ID is generally illegal. Confiscating somebody's passport to force them to perform labor for you is coerced labor. Labor trafficking is a fact-intensive analysis. Not all abuse rises to the level of trafficking. Not all employment law violations rise to the level of trafficking. Ultimately, you're looking for whether the abuser is trying to extract some form of labor or profit from the victim survivor through their abuse, and whether a reasonable person would be able to walk away from the situation without facing severe harm. This will not always be clear, so let's take a look at a few examples. Christina is an undocumented immigrant. She gets hired by Spicky Span Cleaning Company as a janitor to clean office buildings. Her employer knows she's undocumented and has her work 10 hours a day, but only pays her for 8. Her employer also has a secret practice during regular staff meetings of garnishing her wages by making her pay her supervisor $300 in cash. Is Christina being trafficked?
And you can
At,
answer in the chat if you would like.
the answer is probably not at this point. Feel free to keep digging, but at this point, what we know is that the employer is probably violating employment law. You know, but would a reasonable person who's being underpaid by the employer be able to walk away without if there's no further issues? Possibly. So at this point, an immigration lawyer would be hesitant to call this trafficking. Hypothetical number 2. Christina is an undocumented immigrant. Sound familiar? She gets hired by Spicky Span Cleaning Company as a janitor to clean office buildings. Her employer knows she's undocumented. She works 10 hours a day, but is only paid for 8. The employer has a secret practice of garnishing her wages during regular staff meetings by making her pay a supervisor $300 in cash. Spicky Span also takes her passport for quote unquote safekeeping. And her supervisor threatens to report non-compliant employees to ICE. Is Christina being trafficked? Probably. Certainly, if you Spicky Span is taking advantage of the fact that she's undocumented and doesn't have a good way to get another copy of a passport. Confiscating the passport is illegal and coercive. Supervisor threatening to report non-compliant employees to ICE, as you might recall, is an abuse of the legal process. They're trying to extract labor through that threat, and so Christina is likely being trafficked in this situation. Hypothetical number 3. Ricardo is an undocumented immigrant. He gets hired to work at a pig farm. He lives on site in a windowless shack with 3 other workers. The shack's infested with cockroaches and lice. Workers are fired without notice for any reason. The farm owner conducts unannounced inspections and deducts pay for any alcohol found on the premises. He works 14-hour days, gets 1 day off a week, and has seen people get fired for trying to bring family members to the hospital. He is paid for all the hours he works, including overtime. Is Ricardo being trafficked? Likely. So, um, you should always be on the lookout when an employer controls the housing of the employee. Um, because what happens then is that the employer has a lot of power over the employee beyond just whether they're being paid and the working conditions. In this case, if Ricardo gets fired, and he can get fired apparently for just about any reason, he instantly becomes homeless. And so that's a lot of coercion and coercive power that the employer has over Ricardo. Um, and so because of that, uh, he's likely having his labor coerced out of him, and this is a trafficking situation. Hypo number four. Jane has lost her job and is running out of money. She's unable to pay rent for the month and asks her landlord for an extension while she seeks unemployment benefits. The landlord has a crush on Jane and says he will let rent slide for now if he has sex with her. Is this a trafficking situation? Yes. As a general rule, uh, paying for rent with sex is going to be a trafficking situation. The landlord is extracting labor, in this case, a sexual service, from Jane, um, and he is coercing that out of her because if she does not give him that service, she becomes homeless. Hypo number five. Eve moves in with her new husband, Lee. Lee promises Eve that he will take care of earning money and wants her to take care of the home. Eve agrees. Over time, Lee starts discouraging Eve from going to see friends and family without him. He promises he loves her, but they sometimes really do, and they really do sometimes have great moments together. He also loses his temper and hits her if she doesn't clean the house to his standards, and makes her seek permission to go out of the house. Is Eve being trafficked? Probably yes. Domestic abuse to gain house cleaning labor or sexual labor from a survivor is labor trafficking. Remember that sex trafficking must be commercial, but labor trafficking does not. If the same coercive elements exist that would prevent a reasonable person in the survivor's position from walking away, but there is no direct profit motive from the trafficker, remember to consider if the trafficker is just trying to extract labor from the survivor through the trafficker's abuse. Now, something a little different. Eve again moves in with a new husband, Lee, and he promises he'll take care of her. And to earn the money, he wants her to take care of the house. She agrees, and over time, Lee again starts discouraging Eve from going to see friends and family without him. And he promises that he loves her. Sometimes they do have good moments together. But he loses his temper, calls her worthless, which he doesn't clean the house to his standards. Eve also discovers that Lee has secretly installed a tracking app on her phone. Is Eve being trafficked? Possibly, but up to this point, if the facts only lead up to this, it would be difficult to say that she is being trafficked. Keep digging. Lee is not deriving a commercial benefit from Eve, but he does expect to perform domestic labor. But uh, but that in itself isn't a crime. There's nothing wrong with being a housewife. He is socially isolating Eve and maybe emotionally abusing her. Probably, very likely emotionally abusing her from the sounds of it. And if you keep digging, you might find evidence of him controlling her movements. However, the fact that the app has been secretly installed on her phone and that she otherwise, in theory, is able to uh, walk around outside the house, leave the house, and go see who she wants, means that it may not have risen to the level of control where she's not free to move. Could a reasonable person in Eve's position simply leave? It's arguable that they could. Um, that's it. This does not mean that Lee isn't being an abusive husband. And yes, and so Eve may still qualify for domestic abuse services, even if it's not, even if she doesn't qualify for trafficking services specifically. While there are federal trafficking criminal laws, the main thing you will need to know about federal trafficking law is the T visa. It is a relatively new visa that was created in 2000 under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, also known as the TVPA. A T visa applicant can also request for work authorization. Most immigration applications have hefty filing fees, but not the T visa. No filing fee. 5,000 T visas are available every year, not including derivatives, and this cap has never been reached. The T visa is often considered alongside eligibility for a U visa, which is generally available for applicants who have helped law enforcement with an investigation to any crime, not just trafficking. So, if an undocumented non-citizen has been a victim to a crime or witnessed a crime and has reported it, this should immediately power a light bulb in your head for both U visas and T visas. U visas are more generally applicable, but have a number of disadvantages compared to a T visa, such as longer processing times, less availability relative to demand, and a rigid requirement that the applicant have cooperated with law enforcement in some way. T visas are generally a better option for those who qualify. Also worth noting is that a T visa applicant can potentially obtain a work permit while their application is being processed. After USCIS receives a T visa application with a request for work authorization, they'll do a quick scan through it first and make a prima facie determination. If the application looks like it is at least facially valid, then USCIS will grant the applicant a temporary work permit. So, one more hypothetical. Kwamina is 15 years old, born in Ghana. Her father has promised her hand in marriage to a good friend of his. She does not want to marry her father's friend. Her father makes it clear she has no choice in the matter, confining her to a room and denying her food when she continues to insist. She runs away to the US to escape from her father. Firstly, I want you to ask yourself, is Kwamina a trafficking victim? Yes. Yes, she very likely is a trafficking victim. She has uh, been living under her father's roof. He can confine her, he can starve her, and he's trying to extract labor from her. This labor being marriage, forced marriage. And so she is a victim of labor trafficking. Now, the second question, is she eligible for a T visa? The answer is probably not. Certainly not based on these facts. Because while she has been trafficked, she was trafficked in Ghana. T visas apply to people who have been trafficked in the US. There is a very limited exception for when a victim survivor is helping a law enforcement agency who that is investigating trafficking overseas, and they bring the victim into the U.S. To help with that investigation. But chances are you're not going to encounter that situation. For the vast majority of T visa cases, the trafficking needs to have taken place in the US. So, to qualify for a T visa, the applicant needs to satisfy at least these four factors. Number one, they must be a victim of a severe form of trafficking in persons. This is a term of art that we'll get into later. Applicant must be physically present in the United States on account of such trafficking. This one is the trickiest and most unintuitive phrasing. It's a lot broader than it sounds. Cooperation. The applicant must have complied with any reasonable request for assistance with law enforcement concerning the investigation of the trafficking crime, or you must have a valid physical or mental reason why the victim survivor was unable to cooperate, or the victim survivor must have been under 18 years of age at the time of the trafficking. We'll get more into that later. And number four, the applicant must demonstrate that they would suffer extreme hardship involving unusual and severe harm if they were removed from the United States. So let's dive into the first prong. Here you can see the full description of the severe form of trafficking, but the most important thing to understand is that it is all involuntary servitude. Once you understand involuntary servitude, you will start seeing potential T visa cases from people just telling their stories to you. Term involuntary servitude includes condition of servitude induced by means of any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause a person believe that if the person did not enter into or continue in such condition, that person or another person would suffer serious harm or physical restraint. Or B, the abuse or threatened abuse of the legal process. This is probably ringing some bells for you when we were going through the Minnesota law. If a reasonable person could feel that they were unable to not perform some form of labor because they feared harm to themselves or to their loved ones, whether it because of physical abuse, emotional abuse, abuse of the legal process, then they have been subject to a severe form of trafficking. Getting beat up if you don't do the dishes? Possibly trafficking. Have sex with your landlord or be evicted? Possibly trafficking. Work or you'll never get your passport back? Possibly trafficking. The second requirement is to be physically present in the United States on account of such trafficking. Oftentimes, people assume that the physical presence requirement requires that the survivor must have been trafficked into the US. However, the Department of Homeland Security has historically interpreted the physical presence requirement to mean that the trafficking occurred in the US and that the victim has not left the US since the trafficking occurred. Physical presence does not mean that the victim has to have been brought into the US by a trafficker. Instead, it focuses on the applicant's current situation and why the applicant's presence in the US today is connected with trafficking. As we already said, the trafficking must have occurred within the US. There's no getting around that effectively, and the victim survivor may also fulfill the physical presence requirement if they were lured into the US by a trafficker, then trafficked, or they were trafficked while in the US, having entered for unrelated reasons, like a job, or studying, or marriage, so long as the continued physical presence is related to the trafficking incident. Note that dependence on services in the US to recover from trafficking trauma can be a reason for continued physical presence. T visas require the following evidence of trafficking: certification from law enforcement, a detailed affidavit of the trafficking in a personal statement, or an affidavit of any physical health effects or psychological trauma the applicant has suffered as a result of the trafficking, and a description of how this trauma impacts the applicant's life at the time of filing. Or they can do neither if the applicant was under 18 years of age when the trafficking incident occurred. If there were multiple trafficking incidents, the applicant only needs to have been under 18 for one of them. Note that the certification from law enforcement requirement applies liberally. Any law enforcement agency that has responsibility and authority for the detection, investigation, and/or prosecution of severe forms of trafficking in persons can include can certify for the trafficking victim survivor. This includes federal, state, local, or tribal law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, judges, labor agencies, the EEOC, Adult Protective Services, Children's Protective Services, and any other agency that has administrative, investigative, or prosecutorial authority. In practice, the more evidence you can put together, the better. It's pretty much standard practice for an attorney to include more formal mental health evidence in a T visa application whenever possible. For example, it would be ideal to include an affidavit or letter from the applicant's regular psychologist or mental health counselor or therapist, detailing the sources of the applicant's trauma and the effects that trauma has had on them. If the applicant is not regularly seeing a mental health professional, a one-time psych eval from a mental health professional will also suffice. The main potential barrier here is money. These psych evals typically cost a few $100s. The final prong an applicant must prove for a T visa is that they would suffer extreme hardship if they were removed from the US and returned to the country of origin. Remember that extreme hardship can be proven not just through what the applicant would experience from over there in the foreign country, but also what they would be deprived of here in the US. Extreme hardship can be proven through country conditions, threats specific to the applicant, such as cartels or powerful and hostile family members, the applicant's lack of available housing and social support in the country of origin, and as we said, services the applicant is relying upon in the US, which they would be deprived of if they were removed. Including country conditions is more or less standard practice for T visas. Common sources for country reports include the Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and my personal favorite, the State Department's own website. Where these countries have specific human rights conditions relevant to the applicant, you can highlight them. For example, Saudi Arabia is not very friendly to gay people, so a gay T visa applicant is going to want to highlight that. Same thing with experiences the applicant may have had with a cartel, conflicts with ethnic groups, religious oppression, and so on. A lack of material resources and services can, of course, also present hardship factors, not just in themselves, but also to amplify adverse country conditions. You don't want to be relying on economic hardship by itself. But if a person is homeless, poor, and desperate, they are going to be ripe for exploitation from organized crime, which would again be made worse if local police are likely to be unable or unwilling to help. The majority of the work that goes into most forms of immigration applications is in gathering evidence. This is where the most time gets spent and where most delays happen. If you are helping a client put together a T visa application, then this is likely where you will be helping them most. Even if a client has an attorney, your continued involvement in gathering evidence can help immensely to speed up the filing of the application and maximize the chances the application will succeed. So let's take a look at a few of the requirements. Official identification. A passport and/or birth certificate is ideal. In general, we want official identification that tells the federal government who the applicant is, their date of birth, and what their citizenship is. We want a personal statement or affidavit. What is the difference? Well, for the purposes of the visa application, an affidavit is simply a personal statement that has been notarized. Making a personal statement affidavit is not necessary, but it does make it feel more official, so attorneys tend to recommend it. You can go to a bank or to any UPS to notarize the document. Just remember to bring ID. An application can have more than one personal statement or affidavit, so supporting affidavits from family members and community members, medical professionals, and so forth can contribute to the weight of evidence to support a T visa application. Anyone submitting a supporting affidavit or personal statement should also submit a copy of their ID. Something like a driver's license is usually sufficient. While supplementary personal statements are wonderful to have, the one personal statement that is non-negotiable is the personal statement of the applicant. The statement should describe how they were trafficked, as well as the circumstances leading up to the trafficking incident or incidents. If the applicant has received medical treatment, whether for physical or mental conditions, these should also be described. If they have a disability, include it. If they've interacted with law enforcement in connection with their trafficking, include it. If the if, to the extent that they would experience significant hardship, if they were removed from the U.S., include that. Finally, a personal statement should conclude with a sentence swearing under penalty of perjury that the statements contained within the affidavit are true to the best of the declarant's knowledge. Other documents that you may be helping to gather include medical documents, statements from therapists, counselors, mental health professionals, criminal case records, text messages, and photographs.
Just want to let you know, Andy, we have a little less than 5 minutes left.
Will do. Thank you. If the T visa applicant is seeking to get a derivative included, then you will need to gather uh, a lot of similar evidence for the derivative, including the ID, and you need to include evidence of how they are related to the principal. So, if, for example, if it's a spouse, then you'll need a marriage certificate. Now, we're going to touch a little bit on the legal aspect of how Minnesota approaches human trafficking in terms of how it's changing. Um, but in the interest of time, I'm only going to touch on a few things here. Prostitution in general remains criminalized for now, but the penalties are less severe if the conduct occurs only in a private place. Minnesota Statute 609.324, Subdivision 6 makes it a gross misdemeanor to engage in prostitution in a public place. Subdivision 7 of the same statute makes it only a misdemeanor to engage in prostitution anywhere else. What this means is that if someone is in a private space when they are hired as a prostitute or when they have to engage in prostitution, that is only a misdemeanor for a first-time conviction. However, a second conviction can escalate the charges faced. And we're just going to touch here on the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry, which has become conscious of how violations of labor standards can spill over into labor trafficking. They have identified common signs of labor trafficking to look out for, including demanding employees work overtime and regularly forcing them to work beyond a 40-hour work week, not paying employees regularly, and telling them to wait until the employer has cash, look out for vindictiveness. If an employer withholds paychecks to punish employees, that can be a sign of trafficking. If they're dehumanizing workers into just labor, instead of treating them as human beings, and if they're abusing the legal system, threatening to call ICE on a worker, if they're if they are isolating their workers in the housing that they provide, all these are signs. You can reach out to Siv Dobrovony, Strategic Compliance Lead, or Lysol Zamora, Labor Standards Supervisor at the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry if you suspect trafficking. Otherwise, you can refer employment violations to the Department of Labor Industry's usual channels on their website. I'll now pass on to Ana Maria to wrap up this presentation.
So these are some of the direct service providers. You know that we have local ones, so just get familiar with the ones in your area. These are mainly the ones that will serve the whole state of Minnesota. And then the next one, it's this is also other resources that you can use. There is the 27 crisis hotline for victim of domestic violence, sexual violence, the Minnesota Department of Human Services, and if you check the Minnesota Department of Health's website, there is a lot of information there about human trafficking, sex and labor trafficking. So it's good to check all those. And thank you so much for being here. And we hope to see you again next month. Have a great rest of your day.